Welcome. It's delightful to be here. Thank you. So, Patrisse, 6 years ago, you were present at the creation of what's now become a nationwide and even a global movement. Could you just tell us a little bit about how Black Lives Matter was born?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. Welcome to LA if you're not from LA. If you're from LA, LA all day. Yes, 6.5 years ago, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and I started Black Lives Matter. And we started it as a response to what we saw was a crisis around vigilante violence and police violence. And one of the first victims of vigilante violence, sort of in our generation, being Trayvon Martin, that became public. And one of the first, racially charged trials. I think every generation has a racially charged trial. Ours was the trial of George Zimmerman. And what we recognized when that trial was happening is that, in fact, Trayvon Martin was being the one that was really being named as not a victim, but rather a person who, and George Zimmerman and the defense side said that Trayvon Martin was trying to harm George Zimmerman. And so
with Skittles and iced tea.
Exactly. So we spent an entire year, I think, as a generation, really thinking that George Zimmerman was going to go to jail. There was going to be some sort of retribution, but in fact, he didn't, and he was acquitted. And so many of us were waiting for that verdict. And on July 13th, when George Zimmerman was acquitted of Trayvon Martin's murder, we stood up and we said enough was enough. And we started a phrase called Black Lives Matter, turned into a hashtag that then turned into sort of an online force, and very quickly understood it to be something that wasn't just about protests, but organizing a new generation of leaders to take on vigilante violence and police violence.
You're a very non-hierarchical, non-patriarchal organization. It's very grassroots. Why do you think it caught on so quickly, sparking a national conversation? And would it have been possible without social media?
It would not have been possible without social media.
So something to be grateful for about social media.
Yeah. I mean, I like social media for the most part. I think social media is not to blame. Human beings are to blame. And so for us, social media was the megaphone for Black Lives Matter. And I remember on July 15th, I kind of wrote to the public saying, hey, everybody, Alicia Garza and I started this thing called Black Lives Matter. We hope it gets bigger than we can ever imagine.
In this period of its growth, has it changed? Have the goals changed from those initial goals of shining a light on this kind of injustice, or is it still pretty much the same mission?
I think part of what we've recognized in the last 6.5 years is grassroots organizing is critical to making change, and that we need to have a multi-pronged strategy. So you've seen many of the Black Lives Matter movement leaders sort of lean into electoral politics. You've seen some folks run for office. You've seen a lot of folks talk about land ownership and property ownership. And so I think the beauty of Black Lives Matter and its movement, it was always a movement that it was about an evolution and never about a stagnant process. And you've seen it time and time again. One of the big things once 45 was elected was everybody asking, where is Black Lives Matter? And many of us said, well, we're still here. Here in Los Angeles, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles has spent the last 2 years showing up to the Hall of Justice where DA Jackie Lacey is at, challenging her and ensuring, I need more claps than that, guys.
But she's going to face a robust primary now, right? I mean, there's going to be
she's up. I mean, outside of the presidential election, this is going to be the biggest election in the country.
We'll talk a little bit about LA, because you grew up in LA, in circumstances, by the way, that I think we should say probably very few people in this room could imagine. And I highly commend Patrisse's incredible memoir, When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir. But how particularly are the actions of Black Lives Matter manifesting themselves in today's LA, and what are the goals that you were really setting for yourself, and in your Reform LA Jails organization as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of what we've done in the last 2 years in particular in Los Angeles is really look at the impact of the criminal justice system on our communities and our loved ones. And we've spent 30 years as a nation creating a criminal justice system that is invested in decimating and completely ravaging communities. And so the last 2 years have looked like many groups, Justice LA, Black Lives Matter, Reform LA Jails, pushing to end the building of two $3.5 billion jails, which this year we won.
In August, right?
In August, yes. We stopped the building of a women's jail, and we stopped the building of a mental health jail. And for us, the stopping of something is just one part of the fight. It's the building that we are much more interested in. And so what does it look like to build an LA that is really grounded in dignity and care for the people who most need it? People with severe mental illness, people who are cycling in and out of homelessness, folks who are poor in Los Angeles. And as we know, the gap continues to grow here in LA. I was just telling you backstage, I grew up in Van Nuys, and we remember, the one homeless person, his name was Eugene. We talked to him all the time, but you go back to Van Nuys, and there's an entire homeless encampment now. And so this is not an accident, it's purposeful. And so much of the work that we're trying to do is upend the sort of dangerous nature of the system, and also create a new system.
I mean, at the time of the 1994 crime bill, which has become a big subject of debate in the Democratic primary field this year, one of the criticisms of it from the right was that it had too many programs like midnight basketball and so forth and so on, and it was kind of soft-hearted. What are the programmatic things that can be done now to be really more responsive to the community's needs, rather than just have this mass incarceration and criminalization of ordinary everyday behavior with gang injunctions and stop and frisk in New York? What are the programmatic things at the ground level that are needed in LA particularly?
Well, number one, we need a DA that's actually going to do the things that the community wants. We need a DA that's willing to not mass incarcerate communities. We need a DA that's willing to challenge the incarceration of people with severe mental illness. We need a DA that will champion a new way in Los Angeles. So that is critical, and most people don't understand the role of the DA, one of the most powerful elected officials in our nation. Number two, we have a ballot measure that will be passed March 3rd if the LA voters show up to the ballot box and make sure it's passed, Reform LA Jails, that will move the largest dollar amount out of incarceration and into mental health. And so that is incredibly important for us. And then lastly, this is not programmatic, but it really is a call to the audience, which is we've been obsessed with incarceration and punishment as a nation. And we have to not just change policy, but we have to change how we culturally understand accountability. And accountability cannot look like a badge and a gun. It cannot look like a cage. And we need to undo the ways in which we've imagined public safety.
Well, you have pretty firsthand experience with this because both the man you came to know as your birth father and your brother at various times in your growing up years were incarcerated. Your father struggled with substance abuse. Your brother has schizoaffective disorder and has had pretty severe mental health problems. How did that affect you? And I assume it's very much informed your passion for these issues today.
Absolutely. The single most painful thing growing up inside of Los Angeles was not that my father was a drug user or that my brother was schizophrenic. It was the ways in which they were responded to by the police and the system. It was that they did not get the treatment that they needed. There was no early intervention.
Slam against the wall.
Exactly. The only type of intervention was police intervention, which is harmful, dangerous, and ultimately led to my father's death. And so this conversation about criminal justice reform is not just a conversation about policy, it's about real human lives.
I was telling you backstage that more than 30 years ago when I was working as a reporter at the New York Times in New York, covering the New York City Police Department, I had an editor ask me if I wouldn't do a story about whether cops are dumb. And I said, not if you want me to keep covering the cops. But it was my experience that a lot of cops are afraid of the communities they're meant to serve, not familiar with the communities that depend on them, particularly not familiar in many cases with communities of color. What is the answer? Is there any hope that the mission of police and the communities they serve can be synced up better to not have the kinds of interventions that your brother and father experienced, but interventions that are more holistic in nature, in which cops can get the other services for people who need them, and it's not just putting somebody behind bars?
Well, I think that's a great question. My answer is not going to answer your question. It's going to really state another question, which is, why are cops being used as social workers in the first place?
Or jails as mental health facilities.
Exactly. And so we have literally created an entire infrastructure where the only answer we have is policing, instead of an infrastructure where we are looking at, well, what are the needs of community members and what other jobs can be sourced? And so most of what we've done as a community at Los Angeles City and County is poured, half of our city and county budgets into law enforcement. And then you start to look at other budgets, the budgets for housing, the budgets for green parks, and not only are they the smallest budgets, they're continually cut. And so the conversation for us is, what are we investing in? And what do we need to divest from? And so the argument is that divestment really should be out of law enforcement and a deep investment into community-based services.
In just a few minutes, we're going to take some questions, so be thinking of anything you might want to ask. You went to middle school in a gifted program in Sherman Oaks, outside your home neighborhood. And obviously this exposed you to a world that was quite different from the one you grew up in. And in your book, you talk very movingly about having dinner with one of your friends at her family's house and learning that her father, whom you thought was this jolly Santa Claus-like man asking you about your feelings in your life, was actually your landlord, who'd let your apartment be without a refrigerator for a year and let the conditions. What was that like?
As a child, it was, I think I wrote about that moment in the book because it really was one of those moments where you, as a child, you don't realize the impact, and as an adult, you sort of look back and understand the experience more. There's this conversation, I think, about what is a racist, what does racism look like, that is very...
Isn't there a film, I'm Not a Racist, Am I, right?
So, exactly. It's very about the interpersonal dynamics, and we forget that racism is actually systemic. And so being with my landlord, who was also my friend's father, he was actually a really kind human being. But what he was practicing was awful and terrible for my family and community. And so this conversation, I think, as an adult, it's much more nuanced. We have to change systems. We can change attitudes all day, but at the end of the day, if we're not changing the systems, then human beings' lives are at risk.
Well, that's obviously part of why you're here today doing the work you're doing, right? I mean, the gap between those two realities. What was your very first foray into activism that when you knew you had a gift for this and you could make a difference?
I was 17 years old, and I had planned a protest against a homophobic at a park. I was actually kissing my girlfriend. He interrupted us kissing and called us terrible homophobic slurs. And so I got all my queer friends together, and we wrote on posters. There were 7 of us. And, and we protested down Ventura Boulevard. There was no Target then. I didn't know that. I didn't know about Targets. What I knew is that I was angry and I was upset, and I needed the world to know, even if it was only 7 people and it was going to be on Ventura Boulevard in Sherman Oaks. It felt incredibly important to me, and that was the spark that kind of showed me a whole new world around activism.
An audience member wants to know, and I don't know whether you can answer this because of some 501c3 regulations, but who do you support for the LADA, and how can they get involved and support that campaign?
Oh, that's lovely. And you're anonymous. That's not fair. I'm not going to actually say who I support because you're right. I can't really do that. But I will say that anybody but Jackie Lacey. And what I will say is that everybody in this audience should look at all of the DA candidates, see what you're most aligned with, and join that campaign to make sure that that person is on board.
You're not just an organizer, but you're an artist, and you recently got your MFA from USC. Art is really great at making people uncomfortable, right? So what is the most important role for art in making change?
Well, as many artists, especially artists inside of Black movement spaces, we really do see ourselves as part of a long legacy of the Black arts movement. We stand on the shoulders of people like Amir Baraka, And so for us and Paul Robeson, you know, my work is just an extension of the activism that I do. I don't really see the difference between art and organizing. I think organizing makes people incredibly uncomfortable as well. I remember, you know, one of my first massive protests taking on Metro, most of which are the County Board of Supervisors, almost 19 years ago, and like yelling at them, and I was like, oh, I was uncomfortable yelling at them. I know they're uncomfortable, and art does the same thing where it, you know, pushes us to feel and think about things in different ways. And I say art is even more effective because it softens you to be like, oh, I did not understand this, and I understand this more now.
So it opens you. Mm-hmm. Our colleague Adam Server in The Atlantic has a great piece in the current print issue about the dangers of overrating the importance of civility. So when you talk about being uncomfortable yelling at people, being uncomfortable being in people's face, how do you balance that in terms of actually having an effect? Because if you're just yelling at people, they won't listen.
Well, I think you start yelling at people, and then, you know, not
when
just
you've got
people
them,
on the street. Yeah, and then when you got them, you're like, all right, let's sit down and talk. Like, the other thing is that I think people don't realize that Black Lives Matter, it's not like we wanted to shut down freeways, guys. That was not like the thing we showed up and we're like, the first thing we're gonna do is shut down a freeway. It was, oh, you're not listening to us. You're not paying attention to the deaths as a crisis because it doesn't impact you. So we have to elevate our tactics. Shutting down a freeway is one tactic to get you to sit at the table to try to change your mind. And if you're not going to change how you are in power, then we're going to make sure we unseat you.
Well, in your book, you write very movingly about an action you took on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. Just briefly describe that.
It was the first Black Lives Matter action in Los Angeles in 2013, and we all collectively decided that we were not going to go to Crenshaw to protest, because why? Everybody on Crenshaw knows what we're protesting. So we decided to go to Beverly Hills. And we took the streets of Rodeo Drive and took those, you know, those like iconic steps, and spent time as the helicopters hovered over us. We, you know, called on the patrons that were eating their lunch at the time and told them to put down their champagne glasses and their forks and take a moment for Trayvon Martin, because what they were witnessing, the incessant helicopter, that's what we experienced on an everyday basis in our own communities. And they were only gonna experience it for about an hour, and then those helicopters were gonna leave and return to South Central and East LA and Van Nuys and Pacoima. And so take a moment to honor the people who have passed and have been stolen from us. And I think that was, you know, one of the major launches of our movement.
And what did they do?
They put down the champagne glasses.
It seems an appropriate note to end on, but thank you so much, Patrisse, for being here today. It's really important to see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Very good.